This is the episode so many of you have asked me for, and now is the perfect time because in most locations, this is the time to be planting onion sets or seedlings to overwinter and harvest the next summer. Successfully growing full-sized onions for fresh eating and for storage seems to elude many of us. I absolutely had trouble with it the first few years for sure, and I think it boils down to a couple of things. First is planting depth and spacing. The second is soil texture and nutrients, and the third is the timing of the planting. Bonus points if you actually know which type of onions you should be planting in terms of long day, short day, or day neutral. If none of what I just said made any sense to you, you are not alone. So today on Just Grow Something, we're going to review the very basics of growing onions, but then we'll dig deep into the techniques that you can use for getting them planted now to successfully harvest those nice, full, fat onions in the spring. Let's dig in. Hey, I'm Karen. I started gardening in a small corner of my suburban backyard, and now 18 years later, I've got a degree in horticulture and operate a 40-acre market farm. I believe there is power in food and that everyone should know how to grow at least a little bit of their own. On this podcast, I share evidence-based techniques to help you plant, grow, harvest, and store all your family's favorites. Consider me your friend in the garden. So, grab your garden journal and a cup of coffee and get ready to just grow something. Heads up, there's new merch in the merch shop. I got my creative juices flowing again for the fall and the winter season. And if you are a gardening friend who also happens to be a Swiftie, or you know one that is, I am hoping you will appreciate one of these designs in particular. I will link to the merch shop in the show notes. And if you are a seed patron or above on Patreon or a member on Buy Me a Coffee, you should already have received your fourth quarter discount code to the shop. So check your login if you didn't see that in your email. Merch purchases are a fun way to support the podcast while also getting a little something for yourself. But I know not everyone wants more stuff. So if you want to do a one-time monetary support for the show, buymeacoffee.com/justgrowsomething is a really good place to do that. And you can opt for recurring monthly support on both Buy Me a Coffee and on Patreon if that's your jam. All the links to all the things will be in the episode description in your player and in the show notes on my website at justgrowsomethingpodcast.com. And if you have not taken advantage yet of the discount code that was offered to us by Heirloom Roses earlier in the year, it is not too late, but you are running out of time. We have 2 weeks left to take advantage of that. I got my order from them probably about a month or so ago, and I was so impressed by the quality of the plant and how quickly it put on new growth. And I already got 3 blooms on that brand new plant. So you can still order now and use the discount that they offered through October 31st, and then just schedule your delivery for next spring. Their website is heirloomroses.com, and the discount code is JustGrow to save 20%. You will be so impressed with the quality. I absolutely guarantee it. And then finally, do not forget to answer the question of the month for October. What was your biggest failure in the garden this year? So leave a comment below on YouTube or Spotify, send me an email or a DM on social media, or post your answer in the Facebook group. You have until October 31st to get me your answer, and I will absolutely share mine. All right, let's talk fall planted onions. I'm going to review the basics of growing onions really quickly because they are the same whether you opt to plant in the spring or the fall. I will also link to all of the previous onion episodes, the blog posts, and any videos in the note, including the recently released YouTube video that I did about fall planting of onions. I spent 10 months recording what was happening in the garden in one onion plot last year, and then I compiled it all into a video that released last Friday, and it has already gotten people's attention. So if you want some visuals to go along with this episode, then you can check that out too, and of course I will link to that in the show notes. Quick review of probably the four major pain points that we often encounter in growing onions. The first is growing the correct type for where we are gardening. So onions are photoperiodic. That means they are sensitive to daylight. So they start forming their bulbs based on day length. There are three different types of onions. So there's short day, long day, and intermediate or day neutral. Most onion varieties are going to begin to form their bulbs when the temperature and the number of daylight hours reach a very specific level. So short day onions form their bulbs when the daylight hours are between 10 and 12. Okay, so shorter days. Long day onions don't start developing until the day length is at least 14 to 16 hours. So the longer days, right? And then day neutral or intermediate, they will start bulbing during that sort of in-between day length of anywhere between 12 and 14 hours. The border between the long day and the short day varieties lies roughly at the 36th latitude north, or the 36th parallel. North of that, you want to plant long day onions. If you live or garden south of that, then you want to plant short day onions. Just about anybody can grow the day neutral varieties. They will bulb just about anywhere. They do best at 12 hours of daylight, but they're going to form bulbs in just about any growing zone. So if you're unsure, then they're always a good bet. But that's okay. That's review point number one, right? Make sure that you're growing the correct onions for your area where you're gardening. The second pain point is the planting depth and the spacing. So most gardeners plant their onions way too deep the first few times they grow them. So if you're growing from set, which is that little first year bulb, right? The soil should only come up about halfway up on that little bulb. The bulb needs room to expand as it starts to form. If you're planting from seedlings, they should only go about 1 inch deep into the soil. And I'm serious when I say take out a ruler and measure it on your pointer finger where an inch is. You will likely be surprised at how shallow that actually is. And it's a really good way to kind of double check yourself when you're out in the garden to make sure that you're not planting too deeply. Now, the ideal soil texture is pain point number 3. We are growing bulbs, but they're not growing completely under the soil, right? See pain point number 1. So the soil should be loose and fairly loamy, but it also should be free of like large rocks or stones that are going to cause issues with the growth. But it's not like it needs to be really sandy like what a carrot would prefer. So I'm serious when I say you can grow onions just about anywhere, so long as the soil is loose enough. Yes, this can include containers and pots or whatever. Just recognize that if your soil is very heavy with lots of clay, that you may need to just loosen it up and amend it a little bit, since the plants are only going to be about 1 inch in the ground. This is much easier to do than with some other crops. And then finally, pain point number 4, which is the timing of the planting. Onions like to grow in cooler weather, but they need really good top growth before they start forming their bulbs in order to perform their best. So this means that generally we're planting in the spring, and we're trying to get the plants or sets into the ground at a time when it's warm enough that the soil can be worked and the roots of the plant can start to settle in. But it's not so warm that it gets too hot before the bulbs can start to form. So this means that your timing of the planting is based on both the weather conditions and the number of daylight hours. You don't want to plant them just before your day length hits the proper time for bulb growth, because then they don't have any time to put on that nice green growth on the top, which means you're going to get much smaller bulbs. But of course, the soil needs to be warm enough for that root growth, so the plants or the bulbs can get settled in and the roots can feed that top growth. So in milder climates, this is a little bit easier to time, but in colder areas, it can absolutely be a wild roller coaster ride. The coaster ride can happen in the fall too, for sure, but the effects are much less dramatic on the soil temperatures. I will give you a perfect example of this. We were just in Colorado a few weeks ago. Our daughter was getting married on Friday, and I was running the Pikes Peak Marathon on that Sunday. The day of the wedding, that Friday, the weather was absolutely gorgeous, like mid 70s, sunny, light breeze, absolutely perfect on the mountain, okay? Saturday, the next day, was also absolutely beautiful. Sunday, just in time for me to run to the peak of the mountain, it was crap. The weather was crap. 7 inches of snow on the peak overnight, blustery winds. Down at the base of the mountains, it was cold. It got really cold heading up the mountain, so bad that they actually cut the race short at the halfway mark. So we weren't even allowed up to the peak. And then the next day, Monday, beautiful, back to being beautiful, like t-shirt weather. But none of those conditions would have drastically affected the soil temperature, okay? It was vastly different from day to day to day in terms of air temperature, but the soil temperature wouldn't really be affected by that at this time of the year. That same back and forth in the spring, though, can drastically change the temperatures of the soil, especially if we're not using heavy layers of mulch. Exposed soil is going to soak up that heat from the sun pretty readily, and it makes it workable at the top. But then a drastic overnight cold temperature can cause it to freeze right back up again because the sun's heat hasn't really had time to penetrate deep enough into the soil to prevent that from happening. So the back and forth in the spring creates a little bit more of a delicate dance in terms of timing than that same back and forth in the fall, which is why I have started planting the majority of my onions in the fall. And as a side note, when we went to Colorado, one of the things that I packed to take with me was my Magic Mind shots. That might sound a little weird, but hear me out. I took it while we were in Estes Park for my daughter's wedding, and it gave me just kind of the calm focus that I needed while we hustled around getting things done, attending events, shuttling people back and forth across town. And then in Colorado Springs, I made sure to take it the morning of my marathon. It was absolutely the mental performance shot that I needed as I was hustling my way up and down a mountain, trying to move as quickly as possible during the race, but also focusing enough on the trail not to trip and fall on my face. So there are certain routines that I have and specific supplements that I always use right before a race, and now Magic Mind has been added to that list. It has proven itself for me in terms of the energy and the mental clarity it gives me, which is why I am super stoked to continue to be an ambassador for them. Magic Mind has given me an all-new code for you to use to give a subscription a try. You go to magicmind.com/growsomething20 and use code GROWSOMETHING20, and this is the number 20, to save 20% off of a subscription, which, by the way, the subscription rate is already discounted, so you can use the code for 20% off of a one-time purchase too, but it makes so much more sense to just get the subscription. magicmind.com/growsomething20 and use code GROWSOMETHING20 at checkout to get your own mental performance shot. I will link to all of this in the episode description and in the show notes. So now that we've reviewed the basics in terms of growing onions in general, let's talk planting onions in the fall specifically. Planting onions in the fall to overwinter can give you an early summer harvest and ensure that the onions get a head start before the heat of the season. It really does make the timing a lot easier, okay? So here is sort of step by step on planting onions from sets or seedlings with details about like different USDA hardiness zones and lines of latitude. So if you are in zones, say 3 through 6 or 7, if you prefer the ease of using the sets, the onion sets, this is you. Onion sets in 3 through 6, 7 if you prefer to use the sets rather than planting them from seedlings, okay? You want to get those onion sets in the ground about 4 to 6 weeks before the first hard frost. Sort of. Okay. This is definitely when you're on like in zones 4 and 5. This is absolutely true. So you're looking at probably September. In my area, you're looking about right now because we're actually having our first hard frost tonight. And we're, right on schedule, October 15th. The goal is to get the sets to establish roots, but not to develop a whole bunch of large top growth before winter. But I have planted as late as mid-November in warmer years with absolutely no problem. Again, it's more about the soil temperature at this stage of the game and less about the air temperatures and the daylight hours. We just want them to get some root growth on them before they go completely dormant. So in my experience, you will see some top growth depending on the air temperatures throughout the winter. You can see this firsthand in that fall planting onions video that I did on YouTube. When I show the onions in January, they all have long green tops on them. But you do want to plant from sets in these zones because that's how the only way that they're going to be able to really survive in my experience. Now in warmer zones, so again, in zone 7, you kind of get to choose here whether you want to plant from sets or from seedlings, but zone 7 through 11, you can get away with planting them from seedlings. Anywhere where the winter temperatures generally remain above 20 degrees Fahrenheit, you can overwinter the onions from seedlings instead of sets. Again, the recommendation here is to do it about 4 to 6 weeks before your first frost for, if you're in zones 7 through 9. But again, this could be as late as November, depending on what your soil temperatures are. For zones 10 and 11, you should likely be planting around mid-December, okay? So soil prep and planting. We talked already what onions kind of want in terms of that loose soil. They also need it to be very well drained. So if you can enrich it with some organic matter, compost is fantastic for this. We want the soil loose. We want to promote that healthy root growth, but we do not want them sitting in water. I actually had somebody ask me on that most recent YouTube video, where they live, they get 15 inches of rain a year and wanted to know whether or not they were still able to do this, planting in the fall and growing onions at all. And ideally, you want a good amount of water. Just along the lines of everything else that we grow likes about an inch of water every week. But if you are in an area that sees a lot of heavy rainfall, then it's very, very important for you to make sure that your soil is very well drained. And if you do see that the areas where you're growing tend to be waterlogged, you can also make mounds. So if you mound the soil up and you plant your onions along the top of that mound, along that ridge, that is going to give even more opportunity for the water to drain away so that they're not sitting in waterlogged soil all the time. A pH of anywhere between 6 and 7 is fine. They're not super particular about the pH. You do want to fertilize at planting time. Okay, we're going to talk about that fairly in depth here in a minute, but just know that at planting time, you definitely do want to be feeding. And then we'll talk about another feeding schedule and what you should be feeding here shortly. You want to space your onion sets about 4 to 6 inches apart in rows that are spaced about 12 to 18 inches apart. I also will do additional onions and plant them closer so I can harvest skinny little green onions and then harvest again about a month later and harvest spring onions and then get down to that final spacing of between 4 and 6 inches. But you want the final spacing for your large bulb onions to be about 4 to 6 inches apart. Get them watered in, just to kind of help them get established. And then as the weather starts to cool, you want to reduce the water, right? We don't, again, want them sitting in that water, and we don't want it getting frozen either. Mulch is going to help retain the moisture. If it's very dry in the winter where you are, you may occasionally need to water. But again, don't let them get waterlogged. We're going to talk a little bit more in depth about mulch, but we do want to mulch these, especially in the colder zones. If you are in zone 3 through 6, it is absolutely going to be necessary. You're going to want about 2 to 4 inches after the ground begins to start to do that freeze thaw cycle. This is going to help to insulate those bulbs during the winter. If you are in the warmer zones, 7 through 11, mulch is also going to be a good idea. You just won't need as much, and it's less about insulating the plants or the bulbs at that point, and more about retaining the moisture. You are going to want to remove some of this mulch in the spring as the temperature rises, and we will touch on that again here in a minute when we talk a little bit more in depth about mulching. And then through the winter and into the spring, right? If you are in those colder zones, 3 through 6, the onion sets are going to remain basically dormant through the winter. But as soon as it starts to warm up, the soil starts to warm up in the spring and the daylight hours begin to increase, they are immediately going to resume their growth. So you want to keep that soil lightly moist through the spring, especially as the weather warms, and we'll talk about moving that mulch back. In zones 7 through 11, your seedlings are actually probably going to continue to grow a little bit over the winter, but they, again, will put on more growth as the spring approaches. For some of you, like zones 10 and 11, this is actually the best time for you to be growing onions, and they will actively grow all season long, and you will be harvesting a lot earlier than somebody like I would, just because this is the coolest time of the year for you to be able to actually grow these plants. And then once the spring growth resumes, we're going to feed again. We're going to side dress with some nitrogen-rich fertilizer. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about this in depth here in a minute, but we're trying to promote that leafy growth in the spring. That is what we're going for. We want that lush green top before they start bulbing. So what we feed and how we feed it is going to matter here. Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty of mulch and frost protection. Okay, obviously, if we are overwintering these onions, especially someplace where it gets well below freezing, we're going to have to protect those onions in some way. And in most cases, this is going to be done through the use of mulch. Mulch is going to help to insulate the bulbs, it's going to retain moisture, and it's going to suppress any weeds that start popping up in the spring. Now, the best mulch option is going to depend on your climate and what materials you have available for you. My absolute favorite for this is straw. It is one of the best mulch materials for overwintering because it provides excellent insulation, but it's also lightweight. It's really easy to spread, and it's going to break down slowly. So you have a long-term coverage option there. And then once things start to heat up in the spring, you can kind of leave a lot of that stuff in place and it will start to break down eventually. The only downside occasionally to straw is that every once in a while you might find some seeds from grains that could sprout, and that could become a little bit weedy, but usually it's just kind of a grass that pops up and very, very easy to pull out. So if you are in zone 3 through 6 where the temperatures can drop significantly in the wintertime, for me, straw is absolutely your best bet. Of course, zone 7 through 11, you absolutely could use it too. You just won't need to use as much. The second option is shredded leaves. Of course, they're free. So if you have deciduous trees in your area, you can shred the leaves up before putting them on. This part is actually important because the kind of downside to shredded leaves is if they are applied too thickly, the leaves can become like compacted and really soggy, which can lead to actual moisture related issues like mold or even rot. So if you have leaves, make sure that you are shredding them up in some way and then use those as a good protection. If you're in like zones 3 through 6, again, you're going to want them in a thicker layer. Zones 7 through 11, you're only going to need about 2 inches of these. Pine needles or pine straw is also a good one. If you are in the warmer zones, it's a loose, very well draining mulch. It's not going to compact. It does decompose slowly, so you won't have to replace them very often. And contrary to what you may have heard, pine needles do not raise the soil's acidity significantly, so they are perfectly safe to use with your onions. They are not as insulating as other mulches. So it's really great for weed protection and for trapping some of that moisture in, and really, really light cold protection. But if you live somewhere where you get really heavy winds through the winter, they may blow away. So that may not be a best option for you. So for me, mild climates, 7 through 11, where their winters are less harsh, is going to be the best place to use pine needles. Same thing with compost. Yes, you should be adding compost no matter what. It's going to help with that soil texture for the onions. If you want to use it also as a mulch, it is going to provide a little bit of insulation while it does that sort of enriching of the soil, but it doesn't provide nearly as much cold protection as straw or leaves. It will freeze just the same way like your soil does. So again, much better suited for mild winter areas. I would say this one's best like 9 through 11, where heavy mulching for frost protection isn't really as critical. Grass clippings can also be used here. It's also a really good way to add the nitrogen that those onions are going to need. But again, the caveat here is sort of the same as it is with the leaves, where it can mat down if it's applied too thickly, which is going to reduce the airflow, and that could potentially lead to rot. It also can heat up quickly while it's decomposing, which in the late winter or the early spring, when you don't really quite want that much warmth, that could actually cause a problem. So I wouldn't use grass clippings as your only mulch, but if you're going to mix it with some stuff, in the mild climates where the frost isn't as severe and a thin mulch layer is sufficient, then go ahead and add, grass clippings. That's fine. How much mulch should you be using? In the really colder areas, zones 3 through 6, you want at least 3 to 4 inches just to provide enough insulation against the freezing temperatures. In the much colder zones, and I'm talking 3 and 4, you very well may need to put some heavy frost cloth on as well. In fact, I almost guarantee that you will. In my area, I'm zone 6B. Last winter, I did put some light frost cloth on once we got into about mid-January, when I saw the temperatures were really starting to dip. Was it necessary? Maybe, maybe not. It was more me just covering my bases and making sure that I wasn't going to have any problems. But if you're in 3 or 4, even in some colder areas of 5, you probably do want to do this. So 3 to 4 inches of mulch, and then as you really start to get to the cold parts of the winter, then go ahead and double down with some frost cloth. In the milder zones, 7 through 11, 2 to 3 inches should suffice. As a matter of fact, if you're in like 10 or 11, you probably don't even need that. I would say 2 inches, and you're just worried about basically moisture retention at that point. As spring approaches, we're going to gradually start removing that mulch to allow the soil to warm up and to encourage growth. So the timing for removing the mulch depends on your weather conditions in early spring. So if you are in the colder climates, 3 through 6, we are going to remove it gradually once the temperatures start to get above freezing. So this is usually between late March and early April. If you are in the much colder zones, this might be late April, even into early May. What you want to do is watch for the daytime temperatures that stay above 40 Fahrenheit or 4 Celsius, and nighttime temperatures consistently above 25 Fahrenheit or -3 Celsius. Onions are cold hardy, but they need the soil to warm up to resume active growth. So you don't want to leave all of the mulch in place. Removing the mulch too early can expose them to late frost damage, but leaving it on too long may delay the soil warming and the growth. So just start by pulling back some of the mulch to expose the soil to sunlight and to air. That's going to help to warm the soil up. Just keep mulch or frost cloth on hand nearby. So if, a real cold snap is forecasted, you can cover the onions again just to protect them a little bit. And then fully remove most of the mulch, other than a thin layer to keep the moisture trapped in and to keep the weeds down, once the risk of frost has passed and the temperatures are consistently staying warmer. Now, in the milder climates, you can start removing the mulch much earlier. Usually this is around late February to early March. Those of you in 10 and 11, you might not be pulling back your mulch at all. You might just have that, 2 inches, and you're just going to leave it there. But since the risk of hard frost is lower in most of these zones, you can just uncover the onions as soon as the daytime temperatures consistently reach around 50 Fahrenheit or 10 Celsius. Those nighttime temperatures at that point are going to be well above freezing. At this point, the main purpose of the mulch is going to suppress the weeds. And as the temperatures rise, you do want the onions to benefit from warming that soil a little bit. So just gradually thin it out rather than removing it all at once. That allows the onions to adapt a little bit to the warming temperatures without sudden exposure. Just be ready to reapply it if an unexpected cold snap hits. For everybody, basically, you're going to want to check your weather forecast. So if your area is prone to late frosts or cold snaps in the spring, keep the mulch handy and cover the onions again if you need it. If your mulch layer is particularly thick, so again, us in the colder zones, we're talking 3 to 4, you should be doing this in stages over a couple of weeks. You want to remove the mulch when the soil feels slightly warm to the touch and it's no longer soggy from the winter moisture. We want to just let it warm up gradually, but we still want to protect that soil, and so leaving a thin layer down is what we're looking for. Okay, and finally, what is the scoop on fertilizing? Okay, if you plant in the spring, the general rule of thumb is to feed at planting and then feed every 4 weeks until bulb growth starts. Fall planted onions are similar with a slight change in the timing. So first things first, you know what I'm going to preach here. Take a soil test, right? You want to know what you're dealing with. In general, onions need more nitrogen, but you may need to be adding phosphorus or potassium based on your soil test. So know ahead of time, because these onions are going to be using the fertilizer or the nutrients at different stages. They're going to use it differently at different stages, right? So when you're planting in the fall, before you're planting your sets or your seedlings, or at the time you plant, this is when you're going to do the first feeding. A balanced fertilizer or a balanced amendment that has equal parts nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium is perfectly fine at this stage of the game, right? Phosphorus is going to be particularly important for root development, but the nitrogen also needs to be present as soon as growth starts in the spring. So this even ratio of nutrients is going to be perfectly fine, unless you see that you've got plenty of phosphorus and potassium in your soil, but you realize that you have a nitrogen deficiency. Then using a nitrogen-rich amendment is fine. 1 to 2 pounds of a balanced fertilizer per 100 square feet of bed space is generally what the recommendation is. But again, look at whatever it is that you're using and apply it appropriately. You want to work the fertilizer into the top 4 to 6 inches of the soil before planting. If you're doing it at planting time, you can mix this in as you go. And then, of course, if you're using compost, you also want to mix it in when you're preparing your bed. So if you can do all this just before you plant, that is the best option. Then you're just going to let them sit, and don't do anything in terms of feeding them over the winter time. Once the onions resume growth in early spring, they will need some additional nitrogen to fuel that leaf growth, which is absolutely critical for that bulb formation later on. So this is the time to be applying a nitrogen-rich amendment of some sort. So when they start to pop up in the spring and they start to grow their green tops, you're going to want to side dress, which means kind of spreading it along the side of where the plants are, right? Side dress with nitrogen or a nitrogen fertilizer. Do it sort of in a band that's about 2 to 3 inches away from the actual onion plant, because you don't want to burn the roots. And then just do this about every 3 to 4 weeks until the onions start to form their bulbs. And again, if you planted these at the right depth, you're going to be able to see as those bulbs start to expand. So you will know. But another good way to do this is to mark on your calendar, when you're doing your garden plan or when you're doing your planting, when you should be feeding these, but then also when you expect them to start bulbing. You don't want to continue feeding them a nitrogen fertilizer or amendment after they start bulbing, because it's not going to allow them to focus on creating those large bulbs at that point, okay? I generally don't use synthetic fertilizers. I tend to use blood meal or feather meal as my nitrogen source for the spring growth. It's a 12-0-0, so it's nothing but nitrogen. I do tend to use bone meal in the fall when I plant. It is a 3-15-0. So this is excellent for root and bulb development because it's got that high middle number, which is the phosphorus content. It is a good first feeding at planting time. And then in the spring, I will feed with feather meal generally. You can use fish emulsion also. Fish emulsion gets nitrogen in a much lower level. So it's a 5-1-1, so 5% nitrogen and then 1% each of the phosphorus and the potassium. That's very gentle on the plants. So that's a really good one to use also for that early growth. But what I stick to generally is bone meal in the fall, and then I will do feather meal in the spring. Essentially, planting onions in the fall to harvest the next year follows the same rules for planting depth, soil texture, and nutrients, and the type of onion that you should be planting. The main differences are the timing of the planting, whether to plant from set or seedling based on where you're gardening, when and how you feed the plants based on your soil test, please, and the amount of mulch or row cover that you will have to use. I have had such great success with growing onions this way, not just because of bulb size and ease of management, but also because it takes one huge task off of my spring to-do list in the gardens, which is always appreciated. I encourage you to give it a try too, and I would love to hear how you do. Until next time, my gardening friends, keep on cultivating that dream garden, and we'll talk again soon. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Just Grow Something podcast. For more information about today's topic and to find all the ways you can get in touch with me or support the show, go to justgrowsomethingpodcast.com. Until next time, my gardening friends, keep learning and keep growing.